Hello, thank you so much for joining this webinar on using plant and nature-based activities for effective therapeutic interventions. My name is Susan Morgan, and I'm a horticulturist and therapeutic horticulture practitioner in private practice based in the foothills just outside of Denver, Colorado. My approach is following the horticulture for health paradigm that Leslie Fleming, horticultural therapist, has outlined. And so you'll see briefly addressed in my background is I have a varied background in working in vocational and horticulture in the green industry, working at public gardens and landscapes for health, and working in social justice, food action, and nutritional horticulture programs. I have had the privilege of serving a variety of participants in my programming, including elders in assisted living and memory care communities, resettled refugees in networking groups and vocational programs, working with young men incarcerated in juvenile detention and boot camp style jail. And aside from the connection with clients, an often favorite part of my job and the practitioner's job is coming up with activities. Many of us choose this medium because we ourselves have gained the benefits of plants and gardening. There is much meaning in a well-designed and planned therapeutic horticulture activity, but honestly, developing fresh and engaging activities can also be one of the most difficult parts of my job. I hope to get the creativity flowing for you and share ideas on how to take existing activities and make them fresh and interesting. At the same time, though some of my ideas that I'm going to share with you today may seem supply heavy and very highly designed, let's not overlook the overall theme of the quote unquote KISS method, keep it simple, silly. The focus should always remain on how plants and horticultural activities can help participants achieve their goals. So let's begin with some definitions. I mentioned at the top about horticulture for health, and horticulture for health is an umbrella term referring to a wide range of activities, programs, and services where horticulture used in various applications can positively impact health. Horticultural therapy is one such way, and defined as the use of plants, gardening, horticulture activities, facilitated by a trained professional to work towards defined therapeutic goals. In therapeutic horticulture, which is a little bit different, there may be general goals, but it aims to improve quality of life and general well-being while being a bit less clinical and less structured towards achieving patient goals and outcomes. Now, traditional horticultural therapy models incorporate gardening activities such as tending flower and vegetable beds, keeping up with garden maintenance. Active participation in these activities can be quite meaningful for participants in building resilience and targeting therapeutic goals in different settings. There are wonderful vocational and therapeutic models in a variety of settings, including hospitals, assisted living facilities, correctional facilities, and in other places. And they engage participants in different hands-on ways. So here we see some examples of different garden spaces where I have worked in urban and more suburban settings, where we have in-ground garden beds as well as containers, hanging baskets, and raised beds. Aside from active participation in horticultural therapy activities, there's also passive experience with landscapes for health, such as this healing garden at a hospital in Texas. These landscapes for health can be important places for respite. Forest bathing, labyrinths, and many other garden and nature-based settings can help with the restoration of the mind, body, and soul. This is outlined in the research and the qualities of the restorative environment by environmental psychologists Rachel and Stephen Kaplan, which they describe in particular the concept of soft fascination. Soft fascination is basically like any other muscle tires after working hard. Our brain can only hold attention for so long before it tires. Activities of daily life, such as working at a screen, maneuvering through rush hour traffic, taking kids to and from activities, can be quite tiring for the brain, particularly if it's go, go, go all day long. Now, nature is a less stimulating environment, but one that can hold your involuntary attention, and through that allows your mind to idle, wander, and reset itself, which is an essential restorative process. It's kind of like, I describe it as, when you're looking at a computer and the computer essentially, quote unquote, goes to sleep, and you see the screensaver come up and you see this kind of floating patterns of color coming in and out. Basically, there is still processes of the computer going on. It's still, quote unquote, awake, but it is kind of at a resting mode. So that is kind of relating it to soft fascination and how nature can provide that opportunity for our minds to wander. These restorative settings also tap into our biophilic tendencies. Now, biophilia is a term that was popularized by the biologist and entomologist E.O. Wilson, where he suggests that humans have an innate connection to nature, and we have the urge to affiliate with other forms of life. Through that, we seek out connections with each other. Our human connections are very important, as well as the connections with other life forms in nature, such as animals and plants. So therapeutic horticulture activities of nature appreciation through passive appreciation or active participation in gardening activities, for example, are normalized activities that tap into these biophilic urges. Many of my clients are in assisted living facilities with limited resources and limited access to indoor and outdoor spaces. And so we do a lot of activity-based programming based on garden and nature experiences. My programming can be one-time only activities where I only see the group once, or it could be limited to infrequent or bi-weekly meetings. So activities that I often do include container planting, house plants, seeding activities, craft projects using fresh, dried, and pressed plant materials, as well as many other assorted nature and garden-based activities. The question I pose is, are these activities any less meaningful than cultivating a garden, such as in traditional horticultural therapy programs? I argue no, not necessarily. Considering Western lifestyles are increasingly technology influenced and sedentary as a result, people are often staying indoors, among other reasons. Biophobia, I just outlined the biophilia. Biophobia is the concept where nature may be viewed as unpredictable, even scary, with severe weather patterns and frightening wildlife, such as bees, snakes, and spiders. Biophobia may also be a contributing factor to keeping people indoors. When there are limited to no other options to engage with nature, it is important that the practitioner offer creative ways to reach out and engage participants in interactive, hands-on horticultural activities that are relevant, safe, and inspiring. In fact, these activities may also serve as an important gateway to getting participants to go outside and get more involved with gardening and other outdoor activities. So as you can see here, here's some examples of program activities that I have facilitated in various settings. You can see, yes, we definitely getting our hands in the soil and planting things and growing plants from seeds, but we're also doing more crafting and creative projects using an assortment of plant materials and other objects from nature. I also engage participants in outdoor horticultural activities when the facility allows for that to happen. But we often have to get creative due to these limited time and resources. In places that have outdoor gardening space, we get creative with how we plant. So in tight spots or areas where I know that it's going to be infrequent amounts of time that people are coming out and perhaps helping to maintain the plants, or in between times that I can get there to take a look at how things are doing. We use raised beds, such as the veg trug bed here, and containers, as you can see on the ground in the foreground there. These are containers that can be moved indoors and out. And I like the flexibility of having these lightweight plastic containers or other lightweight containers to use. So depending, regardless of what the weather is doing that day, we can move these containers and work indoors and still plant things that can then be moved outdoors and enjoyed in the outdoor setting. We often place containers and our plantings near irrigation so that when the irrigation spray comes on, that often these containers will get some of that side drift of water coming through. It's also very important, as you can see on the ground there, keeping watering tools handy and easy to access helps to enable participants to be a part of the growing process even when I'm not there. For me, it is essential to keep activities fresh and engaging, especially for my participants, but also for myself. So first is to target goals for therapeutic art outcomes. Though it is a challenge to be limited on outdoor gardening options, meaningful and engaging activities can be done indoors and designed to work towards therapeutic outcomes. Keep up with the co-opetition. So the definition of co-opetition is collaboration between business competitors in hope of mutually beneficial results. So as a private practitioner myself and a business owner, I aim to provide unique horticultural programming. I must be able to, so to speak, keep up with the Joneses and see what colleagues and my peers are doing. So I engage through networking opportunities on a regional and national level. I do networking, so I've collaborated with other practitioners. We engage in idea sharing and even make referrals to other practitioners, as well as getting referrals from other practitioners for new clients. And most importantly is to keep things interesting for participants and the practitioner. I like to mix it up, so find new ways of connecting with clients and providing opportunities for meaningful engagement through the activities that I provide. It also, especially in long-term situations and clients that I've been working with for quite a while, having activities that are fresh and new can be challenging, and I try to keep myself going and keep these activities from becoming stale. So finding a new way to present an activity is really essential. So it might take a floral arranging activity and try to turn it on its side. I just did that recently, where taking a traditional floral arranging activity where we had the flowers and you put them in a vase and arrange them the way that you would like to how they look. Is we added an extra step of painting the flowers. I'll show a picture of that later on in the presentation. But today I hope to share some of these ideas about keeping activities fresh. And before we start on that, I want to share a little bit about my personal philosophy of how I approach the work that I do. So in my programming, I have key elements that help inform and guide my development and delivery of activities, working, of course, towards client goals. First is to support engagement through a combination of cueing techniques, including active listening on the part of the practitioner and verbal, nonverbal, and visual cues. So I could do a whole presentation on just this. Without going into too many details, I want to highlight noting how the verbal and nonverbal is really important to watch, and that active listening is very important as the practitioner to keep an eye on participant verbal and nonverbal cues. Paying attention to their body language and behaviors, and on my part, providing undivided attention during engagement. So trying not to be distracted by my cell phone or other distractions during an activity. Using, on my part, the gestures and verbal prompts to direct participant attention to the task at hand, and when appropriate, using redirects to help keep attention on the task. The next element of the session, key element of the session, is incorporating technology when possible. Yes, the point of, a key point of doing these horticultural activities is try to put those technological devices aside and engage with nature. But sometimes it really helps to incorporate technology, particularly to relate to participants who use technology in lots of ways in their daily lives. More recently, I've had the opportunity to engage with clients exclusively through virtual presentations such as Zoom. Invite participants to use their cell phone to take photos, perhaps of an activity, a product that they are proud of, to take a photo of that and share that with others when appropriate. Include videos when appropriate, so to illustrate a point that we're talking about, perhaps about a pollinator going from flower to flower, showing a video of that. Also, including the group to be a part of a citizen scientist program. So citizen science programs are all throughout the world, and you can engage with other gardeners and interested people around the world on helping to contribute to the body of knowledge on a specific scientific topic. Seek opportunities to empower participants through creative expression, connection with others in the outside world, and more. So one such way that I do this is to engage participants as much as possible, and when time allows, as teachers, where they can share their knowledge with others in the group. Activities that can provide creative outlets often give participants the opportunity to express their thoughts and feelings, sharing gifts, trying something new, even when you don't consider yourself creative or artistic. Plants are inherently and naturally interesting and beautiful. And so it doesn't take a lot of effort at times to transform a pressed plant, a flower or leaf, into something beautiful. It kind of gives you a leg up on that, tapping into that creative juices. Connection with others through gardening activities, such as taking a garden walk or taking care of plants together in a group, helps to foster these social connections, not to mention the physical benefits of participating in these activities. Likewise, our connection with Mother Nature. I often try to, particularly when we're doing outdoor activities, I try to include opportunities to learn and discover about pollinators and their importance to the world. So often we will take a moment to sit and watch the garden and see what kind of pollinators and the variety of pollinators we can see enjoying the garden. Some of the garden spaces that we have created, we will apply to the National Wildlife Federation to get our garden certified as a certified wildlife habitat garden. Cultivate opportunities for curiosity, exploration, discovery, and learning. This is an essential part of what I'm devoted to as a lifelong learner myself. I try to cultivate that with my clients as well. So promoting lifelong learning, incorporating opportunities for discovering new things, as well as self-discovery. I also try to use, at times, the use of guided imagery. Guided imagery is where you take perhaps images and printed images and share them with clients and lead them through an exploration of the senses in an effort to cultivate mindfulness and set the foundation for participants to be open to engaging in your program. What's really important too for me is to also, when appropriate, inject humor and fun. So including a joke as an icebreaker, or sometimes I will end one of our sessions with a joke or a series of jokes, and sometimes they're funny and sometimes they're not so funny. And so it's funny because they're not so funny. I also try to invite creative play and imagination particularly for my adult clients, and I'll show some examples of that later on in the presentation, to foster that play, which is an essential part of being a human being. The last key element of the session for me is also taking moments to experience awe. And nature provides us with lots of opportunities to experience awe. Recalling a visit such as this one to the Grand Canyon and experiencing this awesome, massive site. In grand and small ways, we can appreciate and have these little moments of awe, whether it's standing in a forest of aspen trees, immersing yourself in nature, and taking in that sensory experience can be very important to the human condition. Through curiosity and discovery, there is a physiological response to awe. And awe can be experienced through nature, yes, but also through works of art and music and spirituality. And what research shows is that having these moments of awe can actually help to reduce experience of stress, anxiety, and pain, and elevate mood. So as you saw earlier, the picture of the Grand Canyon can definitely evoke an experience of awe, or walking through the forest, or in this case, looking at a flower and noticing all of its details and colors, and appreciating how a plant will make a whole series of these exact same flowers, or slightly different flowers, but they all have similar features to them. So let's move on to the activities. As we move through these activities, you will see how I may do the same activity for different groups who are different ages, have different abilities, and life and cultural experiences. But as a practitioner, I must adapt these activities to tailor them to participants' interests, abilities, and group goals. And often I wanted to start, because this is an essential part of cultivating a garden space, is let's start at the foundation. And so I'm going to talk about doing soil-based and grounding activities that can provide these grounding experiences. Essentially, for this series of activities, it's going back to the basics and the fundamentals. Founding father of the United States and early American psychiatrist Dr. Benjamin Rush noted the therapeutic effects of labor activities on mental health patients. And he described amongst a series of labor activities that digging in the garden has benefits on mental health. And there's interesting new research that also supports how engaging in soil-based gardening activities and grounding experiences can be very beneficial for us. So working in the soil is a grounding activity. It helps to reset the mind. There's just something about taking your bare hands and just playing in the dirt, so to speak. Growing something by planting a seed, or bulbs in this case here, in the ground. There's something about, planting that seed or planting that bulb, and there's no instant gratification. It's not that when you cover that bulb or seed up with soil and add some water that it immediately sprouts from the ground. There's a process and time that has to evolve over time, where you get to see the first buds and leaves starting to emerge out of the ground. And it's a wait and see. And there's something exciting about that. So in my indoor programs, we'll often make our own potting soil or seed starting mix. And so we'll do a soil blending activity where I introduce the different ingredients of a potting soil mix. And we will take the soil scoops and blend them together. And it's important that I pre-moisten these materials to reduce the dust that can be stirred up through the mixing and blending of the soil mixes. So through these soil blending activities, I invite participants to slow down and focus on this activity, which is often goes unappreciated and unnoticed. We usually think about planting a house plant into a new flower pot, and we just dump the soil in, and just the focus is on getting the plant planted. But taking the time to really notice the textures and the feelings of the soil, even the smells of the soil. So here's an activity that I've done, which was actually quite surprising. We were doing a bulb planting activity, and the bulbs came with this kit with a pot and the bulb itself and these compressed discs of soil, or coir fibers. And they're dry and hard. They look like a hockey puck. And so we put them in a bowl and added water. And what was really interesting with this project, whereas when you added the water, everybody got a little bit quiet because they were thinking, I don't know, what are we gonna plant this bulb in? And I said, oh, this is the soil, essentially. And so I invited everyone to take a moment and to watch what happens when you add water to this disc. And these incredulous looks that I got soon transformed into, wow, oh my gosh, look at that. And people started sharing stories about going back to when they were a kid and playing in the dirt, making mud pies. Or for other people, I remember for me getting these little sponges, these little discs of something. You add water, and all of a sudden you can see this little dinosaur coming up. Or in one case, a Mickey Mouse washcloth transformed from this little compressed object just by adding water. So here we're watching the soil grow. But it's very important to take the time to slow down and watch something like this happen. How often do we do that? So other soil-based activities include therapeutic digging stations. These are perhaps in-ground area where digging tools such as trowels and shovels are left, so that somebody coming by can just pick up a tool and start digging in the ground. There are other digging stations where you take a plastic tote bin with a lid and fill it with soil, potting soil, ideally, and taking the lid off and just getting in there with your hands or with a trowel tool and just start moving the soil around. This works with a lot of different populations, including individuals on the autism spectrum. And what through therapeutic digging, what it does for us is work out physical symptoms of aggression and frustration through the active turning of the soil. There's earthing. So earthing is essentially another term for grounding. So taking off shoes and walking, or just pull up a chair and put your feet down on the ground. It could be on bare soil or sand or grass or some other kind of I think about water, even putting your feet down on the ground. And what earthing advocates suggest is that through the direct physical contact with the Earth's electrons on the surface, that can positively affect our biochemical processes that help to regulate our internal biological clocks, aiding in improved sleep and mood, reduced stress and anxiety symptoms, reduced experience of pain, and reduced cortisol and inflammation as a result. Now, with soil-based activities, I bring gloves, whether they're disposable gloves or the gloves from the local gardening store, and I bring them, keep them properly cleaned, and I make them available in the event that if a participant is hesitant to start digging in the soil, that they have the opportunity to engage with the activity on their own terms, and gloves can help to enable that participation. So for some participants who are hesitant to work with the soil for whatever reason, maybe it's a medical condition, using those gloves enables their participation, but over time it may build their capacity to tolerate working in the soil, and sometimes over time those gloves may come off and the participant may start working with their bare hands. So the next series of activities are sensory engagement. So plants are engaging naturally, providing endless opportunities for pleasant and sometimes unpleasant experiences. Horticultural activities lend themselves well to visual and hands-on engagement because plants are tangible. Plants engage our senses: visual, tactile, auditory, olfactory, gustatory senses. Regardless of a participant's condition in the moment, they can experience the world through their senses, even if one or more sense is not intact. I often like to use an assortment of herbs, perennial and annual herbs, as well as seasonal, annual, flowering and foliage plants, because they engage the visual and olfactory senses. And you can see quite the colorful raised bed here. Engaging the gustatory senses, the sense of taste. Here was an activity all dedicated to rosemary. So using rosemary from the garden as skewers for putting mozzarella and tomato on the stems as kind of an alternative form of a skewer, or making rosemary crackers for sampling. Engaging the tactile sense with soft plants, such as the lambsir here. I think of other plants such as sage and some kinds of fuzzy leaf salvia plants. I also think tactile as well as several ornamental grasses. Now, this is where horticultural knowledge is very important because some ornamental grasses can be quite sharp to the touch. So including grasses such as this Mexican feathergrass on the left in a garden where they just naturally invite you to reach out and touch them. And the picture on the right is a prickly pear cactus. That is a plant that when people see that, they intuitively often know not to touch that. But this would be a plant maybe not to include in a garden for therapeutic benefits. But when I show this picture, because we think about a lot of the pleasant, soft touch tactile plants, but there's also plants that when we see them, we know not to and don't want to touch them because they may hurt. Aside from the plants, there are other materials that we use in gardening activities that can also be sensory engaging. And so working with alternative materials, such as this is an activity that I've done with a range of different clients with air plants and sand. So I'll show some examples of some air plants in just a minute, but looking at colored sand and making different patterns with them in glass clear containers or plastic clear containers, and using a variety. This is a Crayola brand play sand. It has a reduced amount of dust, so it's a lot easier and it's safer to work with. But using these little scoops, I think about working with sand, not only because it evokes for me an image of walking on the sandy beach, which is hard to do living here in the Rocky Mountains, but also sand is the sound that it makes, the texture of it, when you touch it with your fingers, or imagine, doing a grounding activity, taking off your shoes and putting your feet in the sand. There's something very textural and sensory engaging with that. Through this air plant activity, we also dunk our air plants in water. And so the sensory feeling of the cool, wet feeling of wetting your hands. I found through this activity that some participants will submerge their hands in the water and just keep their hands in the water for a few moments. There's something very cool feeling about that. And you can see the final product here. But through this activity, we talk about going to the beach and imagining ourselves on a tropical vacation. And through that, we learn about how air plants grow and learning about the unique tropical and subtropical environments that they grow in. We think about all the different varieties of air plants. And so, I saw, just as how this activity developed, I saw a trend of air plants, people using these unique soilless plants in different ways as house plants. And so I started to do some research and essentially go vertical, kind of dive deep into this topic of air plants and learn about the different ways in which they grow and how they have developed these unique plant adaptations to be able to grow in their humid environment, and how they're able to take in moisture and nutrients through their modified leaf parts. A lot of air plants do form roots as well, but as you can see, there's a really intriguing plants for clients to engage with. The outside of an outdoor gardening program where you often think about planting things in soil, air plants grow up in the branches of trees, or they live in rocky outcroppings, and they have adapted to grow in these unique environments without growing in soil. Working with air plants also got me thinking about other forms of plant life that also have really interesting textures. And so I've done a lot of activities with preserved mosses. And I think about the tactile experience of working with the soft mosses, but also through this, we show the diversity of this group of plants and showing the different shades of green in which they grow. But then also, taking the contrast of the pallet wood, recycled pallet wood frame that is made here for the box, and including the different soft textures of the moss inside. And here we have hangable art that can be enjoyed, and it's essentially a sensory box that you could reach out and touch while it hangs on your wall. But I don't often like to get too far away from soil. So, we started out talking about these activities uh, uh, with doing the grounding and soil-based activities, but I often like to do an activity called kokedama, which incorporates that preserved moss with soil. And kokedama is essentially poor man's bonsai. And it's interesting to learn the history of this technique of growing plants that evolved out of Japanese gardeners, and where they would take harvested sheets of moss and bind the root balls in the moss, and they could grow house plants or their own bonsai this way. Because if you think about, hundreds of years ago, not having plastic nursery pots or ceramic beautiful pots to just go to the store and buy to use, resourceful gardeners would have to find what they had around and would be free or cheap to work with. And moss was a great way to bind the soil and kind of hold it intact around the roots. So through this activity, there's the engagement with the soft textures of the moss, but in order to make the moss malleable to work with and wrap around the root ball, we have to dunk it in those bowls of water. So again, there's that sensory engagement piece. And then wrapping the root ball with the moss and then tying it in place with some string. And this activity is made easier when you have helping hands, somebody to hold the moss up around the root ball and somebody else to tie the string around the moss to keep it in place. You can see through this activity all the different ways that the senses are engaged through this. And it's a unique way to grow a houseplant. So some way to turn a typical houseplant activity on its side and do it in a little bit more unique way. And there's also, through this activity, the opportunity to learn about culture and how different people do things. The next group of activities are, and what a lot of practitioners like to focus on, are the metaphors and perspectives. So looking at things in a different way, perspective shifting ways to see the world through nature's examples. And these metaphors may not be obvious to participants, so they may need to be guided. And the practitioner can be the guide to shifting outlook and noticing different ways of looking at the world. One such way, and I mentioned early on in the presentation, is the element of play and imagination, which is often difficult for adults. The older we get, sometimes for many of us, the less we think about, we think about recreation, but we may not think about play as a part of recreation. And so so it's important to take care with how this is presented to certain populations. And this type of activity may or may not be appropriate for your group. So it really is essential to tailor this kind of activity to the group. And this activity here is a fairy or a gnome garden. And essentially, it's another creative way of planting a house plant and giving a participant a plant for them to take back and nurture on their own. But what I like to do is invite and share examples of pictures of other people's creations of fairy gardens or gnome gardens, and talk about these fantastic fantasy creatures and show different ways in which somebody could create a little miniature world for themselves. And using the plant and using other objects, such as, dollar store sells these butterflies in the floral department, or using air dry clay to make your own little toadstools. We use other objects from nature, such as pine cones and moss and seashells and other things. And it's interesting because, even the most hesitant to play activity participants, this activity, over time, as somebody's creating their little world in this little dish garden, they start to get kind of relaxed and have a little bit of fun with it. And it often evokes reminiscing, sharing stories about play as a child. I think about model railroads, hearing stories about having a model railroad, maybe a railroad that would only come out at Christmas time, or playing with other child play activities such as marbles or jacks or even pickup sticks. And I invite participants to imagine what it would be like to experience the world from this perspective. So imagine yourself much smaller, so that this would be, a large plant that you look up overhead and you see the striping of the leaves overhead. And imagine what, a gnome experiencing this garden on a small scale, what they might appreciate as a feature in the garden. Or play with another miniature garden, such as this terrarium. This is a terrarium, I call it an aquarium terrarium, that was planted as part of a group. So everybody got to select a plant, and we all took turns planting their own tropical house plant in this garden terrarium. So you can see the spider plants, the peperomia, the African violets, kind of all intermingled in here, and a mulch of moss, kind of to help put all the reinforce the color of green here. This is an activity that I often like to do in the month of January, which I call International Houseplant Month, where I try to get green things in the hands of participants. Because for many in the month of January, it's typically a time of gray and brown. When you look outside the window, you see the deciduous trees have lost their leaves, and the grass is dormant, or you might see the blanket of snow on the ground. And through this activity, we focus on the textures of the plants. And note, you don't see any vibrant colors. You see mostly different shades of green. Another miniature world is this Zen garden. This is a tabletop Zen garden. And so through this activity, I like to share about the culture, Asian culture, where this Zen garden design developed from, and teach participants about how the design and symbolism of a Zen garden is very important. So through this activity, it's a meditative activity where we cultivate mindfulness. We might play music, or naturally through this activity, participants will tend to quiet down as they focus their attention on careful selection of the materials here. And through this, we talk about the symbolism of the walls of the Zen garden. You see the sides of the garden here. Shield out all the distractions of the outside world. And then I invite participants to be intentional about the placement of the objects, and how the different objects in the Zen garden are very minimalistic, but they create points for the eye to rest without distraction. And the symbolism of the materials used also represent the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And you can see the base of this is sand, and I use a craft sand, and made a little raking tool out of dowel sticks. Or if you don't have the woodworking tools to be able to do that, taking a fork and transforming that into a rake, and raking different patterns into the sand, and erasing that, turning the fork on its back, erasing the pattern in the sand, and start over again. And who's to say you can't pick up the rocks and the moss and move those around, or even take them out and just have a raking sand moment. So other opportunities for metaphors and perspective changing is this ivy topiary activity. I did this with a resettled refugee women's group, a series of groups of refugee women from all over the world, resettled in the United States. And we discuss, as through the planting process here, we discuss how the hanger, that wire hanger that we transform into whatever shape they want to, and you stick the hanging end that would normally hang on the rod, you straighten that out and push that straight stem down into the center of the plant, and then train the vining stems of the ivy plant to grow onto that topiary shape there. And discuss the metaphor of these topiaries and how the supporting structure for the plant can be a representation of what, discussing all of the different means of support as these women adjust to life in a new country, and thinking about the different ways that they can be of support to each other and the other sources of support in their community. Other examples of metaphors. I love the example of trees, and looking at trees and taking the group outdoors on a nice weather day and sitting under the shade of a tree. And it could be any tree. It doesn't have to be a large bodark tree or Osage orange tree, some people call it, as depicted here. It could be any kind of tree that grows in your area. I think about the mighty oak. And trees are often looked at as representations of strength. And so I've done a whole activity on warrior plants and sharing different examples of how plants have survived throughout history or through their own series of challenges. There's an example of a bonsai plant at the United States National Arboretum in Washington, D.C. that is at least 400 years old and started its life in Japan and lived in a town called Hiroshima and had already been about 200-300 years old when the Hiroshima atomic bomb was dropped. And this bonsai survived that blast. I also think about another example of a resilient tree. There's the Great Basin bristlecone pine trees in California. There's a whole stand of them in California. And these are thought to be the oldest trees in the world. There's a particular one called Methuselah that is the oldest tree thought to be in the world. This example here of the bodark tree, I share this story as a great cultural story of learning about how Native Americans would take this very strong wood and fashion bows for hunting out of this wood. Also, I do activities based on dendrochronology, or the study of tree rings. And so you can see this was a sign at a botanical garden that I visited. And learning about, through the study of tree rings, you can learn the life of the tree. And so I will take cross sections, or tree cookies as I might call them, and note all of the rings here and note the distance between the growth rings, starting from the center and moving outward to the bark. And we talk about how the more distance between each ring indicates that during those times of its life, the tree had its needs met. It had sufficient amount of water and nutrients from the soil, had the right amount of sunlight for it to grow. Versus other times, you can see the tree rings are a lot closer. Where the tree struggled a little bit, it perhaps didn't have as much water. It faced other challenges, such as damage from insects, disease, humans, or fire. And through this metaphor, we can talk about, I've done this activity with my women's groups. We talk about the resilience of these plants to keep growing despite the challenges and the successes, the positivities of life as we move through life, and using the metaphor of the tree story to relate to our own. This is an example of petrified wood. So looking at the cross section of a tree that existed millions of years ago and petrified into stone. So I mentioned earlier about, a personal philosophy of mine is to engage clients with lifelong learning and perhaps shifting their perspective on things. So when we look at different objects in nature, for example, such as these flowers, looking at them in a different way. So not just looking at them as flowers, but looking at them as perhaps examples or representations of other patterns or things that we've seen in life. So when I look at some of these flowers, such as the artichokes on the left there, I see fireworks displays. I think about all of, going to a patriotic firework celebration at night and watching all of the fireworks exploding and thinking about feeling the booms in my chest. But then I also think about the patterns and the colors that they make in the nighttime sky. And so that translated into a floral arranging activity For American Independence Day, the red, white, and blue colors here painting the flowers. Yes, we could use naturally colored flowers for sure, but a way to keep costs down, taking these flowers and painting them into patriotic colors, or doing this at another time of year for other celebrations that you might see fireworks displays. So looking at things a little bit differently than how you might have initially seen them, and how a practitioner can help facilitate those shifting perspectives. And then the last set of activities that I want to share is that, working in horticultural therapeutic activities can provide opportunities for creative expression, even for those who don't consider themselves to be very creative. Plants are tangible objects and inherently beautiful, and they're more inviting to engage with than, say, a piece of blank paper and paintbrushes and paints. Sometimes that getting to that point can be quite intimidating. So maybe transforming the paintbrush into a flower and, giving somebody a piece of blank watercolor paper and paints and the flower, and say, we're going to use this flower as a paintbrush. So it might be intriguing to see what kinds of patterns that you can come up with using a flower as a paintbrush and what that can do. And just looking at as maybe a scientific experiment, or in this case, an artistic experiment. I like to invite participants to think outside of the box, doing these unique activities. And sometimes we also will celebrate culture through the creative expression of these activities. For example, creating flower crowns. So just taking a simple piece of wire, making a couple of boutonnieres or a boutonniere, just assembling a little bouquet of flowers together, and then wiring or using floral tape to wrap that onto the wire crown. It's fun and really interesting for everyone to see what you can create out of these flowers and making wearable headgear. Here we were doing an activity for celebrating the Kentucky Derby, where you think about seeing the Kentucky Derby in the audience. The people in the stands are wearing the women are wearing often these elaborate hats. And so making our own and putting the flower crown on, and then giving somebody a mirror to see what they look like with the crown on their head. Or for some, taking a cowboy hat that they were wearing to a session that day and transforming that into a Kentucky Derby cowboy hat. And somehow we had a horse figurine on hand to play around with that and have some fun. Making a mask. So here we are celebrating Mardi Gras, which was an upcoming celebration, and the group, several members of the group were from the New Orleans area, and so we fashioned out of colorful feathers and pressed flowers, making Mardi Gras masks. And it was fun to try on the masks and look at yourself in the mirror, and then we had a parade through the community with the masks on, but then also other embellishments, the costumes and the necklaces, the colorful necklaces, and sharing them with other people in the community. Through this activity, you could also program this for certain clients to discuss the masks that we wear when we are interacting with different groups of people. Maybe how we have to adjust the way that we interact with one group of people versus a different group of people. I've been doing the Mardi Gras mask activity for a while, and so I thought, well, how can I transform this activity into for a different celebration? And so here we're doing for Dia de los Muertos, which is a festival that's celebrated in Latin American culture around Halloween. And it's a spiritually significant celebration for many families. And the marigold flower is a significant flower in that celebration, where family members will set up an altar to their lost loved ones. And it is thought that through the pungent scent and the colors, the bright colors of the marigold flowers, that it attracts the spirits of loved ones who have passed to the altars, and so the family members can celebrate their lives. So we learn about culture through this activity, but it was a different way to transform. Instead of, in the other example, we used pressed flowers and feathers. Here we used dissected flowers. So taking a flower and separating it and getting creative with how to use those flower petals and then arranging in a unique and colorful pattern here. Using pressed flowers and leaves, it's fun to, this is a great indoor activity for a day when the weather is not so great. Pulling out the paper and the glue and, harvested flowers from the garden or purchased ones from vendors. I like to take the sticky paper, the self-adhesive laminating sheets, and transforming them into stained glass, nature stained glass or sun catchers. This is from an activity during the dog days of summer in August. We learn about where that phrase comes from. It's related to the stars. And we create these different patterns using different flowers and leaves pressed from their garden just outside. We put them in a clear plastic frame and put them near the window, and you can see how the light coming through the window transforms these flowers at different times of the day. Other forms of creative expression. So we think about painting and in this case here we had some recycled pallet wood troughs that were planted with house plants and painting them and personalizing them. And lastly, to celebrate different culture through creative expression. And so this is an activity that we have upcoming for February of 2022, when the Winter Olympics will be held in Beijing, China. And so we have a couple of activities. I mentioned earlier about taking a traditional flower arranging activity and transforming it through painting flowers. And so just taking a paintbrush and dabbing gold and silver for the gold silver medals in the Olympics, and painting the flowers gold and silver and arranging those painted flowers in a cup vase, as you can see on the left. Then, because it also happens to be February, we made dried rose red envelopes. The red envelope has a cultural significance in Chinese culture during Chinese New Year, when red envelopes are given to family and friends, usually stuffed with money or other trinkets, as a form of wishing somebody well for the new year. And so Chinese New Year happens to be in February of 2022. And so it happens to be in 2022, the year of the tiger. So that's where the stamp of the tiger comes from. And so we just embellished the red envelope with dried rose flowers that we just take your fingers and crush the flower petals to smaller pieces. And then we used Elmer's glue to affix them onto the outside of the envelope. So I've shared many different activities with you. I hope that as you were watching the presentation, you got some new activity ideas for your own programming, but also to see how you can adapt these activities to suit your therapeutic goals for your group. And I could take one activity and adapt it for different clients with different abilities and different cultural and life backgrounds. So I hope that during this presentation that you learned some new things, and I appreciate and thank you for the opportunity to present different therapeutic horticulture activities. I hope that it suggested ways in which you can interpret and deliver these activities to your own participants. A practitioner's challenge is to keep the activities with participants fresh and interesting, but offer a unique and interesting and understandable way to engage participants in the therapeutic process. And as you can see, we've provided a lot of different ways in which plants and horticultural activities can be engaging for clients. And I look forward to seeing your different ways of taking maybe some of my examples here and making them your own, or taking inspiration from some of my activities and making entirely new activities that engage your clients. So thank you very much.